Go to TAPgiles.com to learn dreams, engage my services, and support the channel. Martin Nebelong was talking about how could you make a drawing setup within a scene for people to use. So I kind of made one, and so we've got R2 is to draw, like that, and the dynamics is on opacity, so if I hold it lightly, then it's lower opacity, hold it more fully and it's more strong, like that, and yep, and I can push the touchpad to clear it. Cool, and then R1 to change, so then I can do size instead based on the pressure, like that, and I can increase the max size, so I can go larger now, and size and opacity, so it fades in the size and the opacity of it. So here I'm making really tiny thin line because the max size is small, and now I'm holding it full, and that's as big as you go, so because I've changed that. I can toggle the UI like that. Yeah, so first we need to know where the imp is and where it's pointing, so I'll turn on the grid, and I'm going to use a imp tracker, like that, and then I'll put some logic in here. So I'll put a chip there, bring it forward, and then I'll put some stuff in the chip. So first we want to kind of reach into the scene and know what I'm pointing at. So I'll use a laser scope for that and move the gizmo up to the tip of the imp there and then point it forwards, and then I can just make it as long as I want until it's at least long enough to hit the wall. I'm going to make a fleck now to be able to emit when we draw, so I'll get it doesn't matter if I'm on the grid or not, and I use a circle and make it black, and then just click X a few times on the same spot to make it darker. And now we've got this circle. Yeah, so we want to be able to kind of use this location of where it hit to tell the emitter where to emit that object. So if we get an emitter, then we will link it to that object, and now it will emit, this gadget will emit that object as many times as we want into the scene, and we can put time between emits to 0. That means it will emit as many times as it can, which means every logic frame, and that's 30 frames per second. And we don't want to limit how many it emits and stuff, but you can see the center of it is offset because it's a painting. It kind of has some weirdness going on with it. So that's just the preview, but the original object is still in the scene, and that's what we want to edit. So if we go to show and hide and turn off preview invisibility, then we can see that object. And all this, when we linked it up, it turned that object off, and that's all that happened. That's why it disappeared. But you can see it again, and you can power it on if you want to. So I'm just going to group this up with some other object, which will help me sort the center out. So I'll add a chip. I'll just make it small and group those up. Okay, and while this emitter tweak menu is open, you can see it's got a red dashed line going to this other object. Oh, we need to retarget it to the group now because it's not just a fleck, it's a group. There we go. And as I move this other object, it's kind of using the positions of all the objects in this group to figure out where the center should be. So as I move an object, it will move where the center of it is. Like that, so that's about right. And then to kind of lock it in, I need to link it up again. And now it will re-figure out, you can see the difference there. It still thinks it's got the old center. And then when you re-link it, it re-figures out where the center is. So that will do fine. And we can wire this hit position of the laser scope into the scene space transform of the emitter. So this takes a full transform, which is position, rotation, and scale. But if you just send it a position only, then it will still use that, so that'll be fine. And now let's go in here, and you can see it's kind of drawing as I move the imp around. But you kind of want, when I'm pointing over here, you want it to emit a fleck underneath the imp tip, so that it's easier to use. So for that, we just tweak the imp tracker and go to the second tab and turn on gun style. So that means as we so you can see with what's happening normally with the imp, if I point over here, it's kind of seems like it's looking inwards, it's rotating around, but actually it's staying parallel to the view. So it's kind of shooting a line from the view, which was over here, straight on down here. And when we move the imp, we're not moving it very much. Like you can tell with the shadow, for example, if we were in the same angle as the sun, as we move around, you can see the parallel lines would go kind of more down there, and that's not what we want. So the gun style is, as you point to the left, the whole thing will angle to the left as well, so that it all kind of matches up visually. So that's what we're going to do. And now it's perfectly underneath the imp tip. Cool. So now we just want to emit that while we're actually pulling the trigger or using some control. So I'll use a controller sensor, and we don't need these default wires. And we'll go in here and set it to remote controllable, so that these things work regardless of whether we're possessing this object or not. For now, I'll just use a calculator and wire R2 into it, and say if R2, so R2 is a percentage of how much you're pulling R2. So if we say, is it more than some number, then we power the emitter, then it won't draw until we pull R2, and then it will emit, and job done. But we kind of want it to be able to change depending on how much we're pulling R2. So instead of that, I'm going to use a timeline and wire R2 into the bottom of the timeline of the playhead there. So now if I pin that to the screen and pull R2, the more I pull R2, the more along the timeline it will be, and when I let go of R2, it goes more towards the left. So it'll activate different gadgets and stuff depending on how much I'm pulling R2. So if we put the emitter on, like that, then it'll emit while we're pulling R2 at least that much, sort of thing. So that works the same. But now we can do stuff like affect different other settings. So for example, the opacity. If I have a slider, this is the paintings tweak menu, and I can wire a value into opacity and use L1 and X to go to the overwrite plug looking wire blend mode. When it emits an object, by default it doesn't restore any of the wires going into the new object. So this is going into the original reference object, but the new objects won't have that wire going into it unless we change a setting. But we actually want this to work a bit differently. So if we wire from opacity into itself, then that should work. So now it's at that 40% opacity. There's another tutorial about looped wires that talks about why that works and what's going on. But the main idea is it's constantly sending in this 0.4 value, but when it gets emitted, it kind of remembers it for a split second, and then if we wire it into itself, it keeps re-remembering it, and it kind of stores this value forever. So that means we can kind of change this. So if I did a quick with an action recorder and just change that over time, and that'll be looping, so that's fine. So if we draw stuff now, then it's changing over time for the new ones, but the old ones keep whatever opacity they had at the time. So we can do the same in here. We can just say, let's keyframe it to full opacity at that end and have it on low opacity at this end. Or let's have it like 0.1. Make sure we can see it. And use up on the D-pad to kind of scale this up. And you can even use stuff like the different blend shapes with L1 and X between these. So I could say use that, and now we get more variation we can do with very light presses. And as we pull more and more, we get a thicker line or a more opaque line. And that. Another thing we could do, so I'm just going to turn that line off by using the show sidebar setting on the timeline, and now we can turn off that entire row, and now we can have some more keyframes doing something else. So remember earlier we talked about how we can send in a position, rotation and scale into the emitter. Let's use the scale to make it emit small dots or large dots. So first we need to make, so that was called a scene space transform, and we can make a transform by using a combiner and putting it into transform mode. So now we've got an input for position and rotation or orientation and scale. And we want to use the same position from that, and it should use the combiner. But we want to set the scale in different ways. So let's use a value slider over here. Wire that in. So again, if we put like 0.3, that will permanently set it to 0.3, and now it's really tiny. And we can keyframe that to different amounts. So this will be the smallest amount. And the largest amount, 100%. Put a scale between them, and like that. And now the more we pull R2, the larger the dots will be when they're emitted. So if I hold it really lightly, and if I pull it more and more, like that. And then to be able to make it so the player can kind of affect the maximum scale of this, we can just use a signal manipulator to affect this value before it goes in. So let's get a signal manipulator and wire it through that. And at the moment it's not going to do anything, it's just going to output the same value you send in. But if we use the custom remapper, we can say the input, which is from 0 to 1, is mapped to this other scale, so 0 to 5.79, for example. And now it's still small when I hold it very little, but it gets to a bigger size if you pull it a lot. So let's have, I want to have another setting that we can affect, and hold a button to increase it or hold another button to decrease it to affect kind of how far up this goes, basically. So we'll leave it on up to 1 there, and then we'll be using another timeline which we will control the playhead of, but in a different way. So if we use a timer, this has a timer output, and we can wire that in there, and that is the percentage through the timer. So as this goes on, it goes through and gives a bigger percentage, so that will control the timeline over there. And if we use speed mode, we can send it different speeds to go at. So if I use a value slider to test and wire that into start timer, then while it's on 0, that's going at 0 speed, so it's not changing. If we send it a positive value, then it will go at 60% of normal speed. And if we get a negative value, it's going 40% negative speed, and things like that. So if we set this to 2 seconds, for example, and make this 50% through, which is 1 second, then we can it will start off in the middle, and as we hold a button to increase it, it will increase, and decrease it, it will decrease. And that will affect this timeline. So this should keyframe this to different amounts. So let's just make it larger, doesn't really matter. And then we blend it with a normal keyframe. Right, so if we watch that and that, then as we increase it, that increases. As we decrease it, that decreases. So now what kind of control do we want? I'm going to use the D-pad and have it be up and down on the D-pad. And I'll use a combiner, and this has a positive and negative. So I'll have up be positive to increase this and increase the maximum size. So we'll wire up into the positive, and then we'll have the negative, the down button, send a negative speed, which will make this go left and will make this come down again. So we'll go down button into the negative, and this just sends out the result. So that minus that, and that's what it sends out basically. And we wire that in there. So now if I just keep on drawing and I hold down, it's quite small, and as I push up on the D-pad, the largest gets even larger. But I can still get a range of sizes. It just affects like the overall scale of it, sort of thing. Yeah, so that's basically how I did it, and then I added some like UI and bells and whistles, and that's about it. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something interesting. Go to patreon.com/TAPgiles to learn something new every day.